In this episode, we're going to hear from several police officers who have seen the strangest things while on the job, and I'm not talking about people here. Also, I have some really cool new content coming out on my true crime channel. Next up is an episode on Gary Hilton, the National Forest serial killer. The links are below so you can subscribe so you don't miss out on that episode. Now let's get into the stories. I was a police officer for about 6 years in the city of St. Charles, Missouri. I would work the third shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. So my time off was usually spent with my family or at the gym during the day and on the weekends. One weekend, my wife and I decided to take our 2 dogs out for a walk around midnight on Sunday night. We took our dogs out for their walks every night I got home from work, so it wasn't unusual for us to be walking them at this time of night. We were walking along one of the trails that ran behind our neighborhood when we came across a group of teens who were having some sort of party in one of their backyards. I was about to tell the kids to shut it down when my dog started acting up. I have a German Shepherd named Vader that is very protective of me and my family. He is very calm unless he senses a threat. This particular night, he was acting up so much that I decided to head home without stopping at the party. It was completely out of character for him. As soon as we got back to our neighborhood, we turned left and headed towards our house. We had just passed one of the intersections in our neighborhood where all of the backyards are located when I heard a loud howl coming from behind us on the trail. It sounded like someone let out a yell, but it was too loud and too deep for a human to make that noise. My first thought was that someone was playing around with their dogs, but then again, I'm usually the only one playing with my dogs at this time of night. I looked over at Vader and saw him looking towards the sound. His ears perked up, but he didn't seem scared or concerned about what he was hearing. He kept looking back towards the trail, as if trying to figure out where it came from. Or worse, if someone was following us, because in this stretch of woods there isn't another house for 200 yards or so. All 3 of us stood there. My wife was freaking out. I was taking my cues from Vader, who is a retired police dog, having worked in criminal apprehension and search and rescue. If he started to freak out, then it was time for everyone to freak out. Out of nowhere, we heard another loud howl. This time it was considerably closer to us, but coming from the same direction. My wife freaked out a little and started screaming for us to run. I grabbed her by the arm and pulled her towards me. Vader started to growl, which got my attention, and the hair on his back stood straight up. He was applying steady pressure on his leash, and he was locked in on something in the strip of woods to our right. That's when I saw what he was looking at. Something big walking through the woods. Surprisingly, whoever it was moved gracefully for being so big. As it got closer, Vader got more wound up. I could make out that this thing had red eyes. I started pulling on Vader's leash, but he wouldn't come. Finally, I yanked him and he went up on his back legs and spun around, and we all started to run. We made it about 50 yards down the trail when we heard another loud howl coming from behind us. This time, it sounded like whatever this was right on top of us. Vader tried to stop and look, but I didn't give him the chance. We finally made it home and ran inside and locked the door. Needless to say, it was a rough night's sleep for all of us. My wife and I couldn't sleep because of the fear and the adrenaline, and Vader paced the house all night. We took a few nights off from walking the dog near that section of woods, and have never had another experience like that one. But a few weeks later, while I was on patrol, a call came across about an individual claiming that they had just come in contact with a werewolf. The location was only a half mile from my house. I was a deputy on patrol in Galax, Virginia, a very small town nestled in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. There is never really much going on. A few high school or college kids causing a ruckus and whatnot. But other than that, Galix is a quiet, safe town. I was on my way to the station to write up a report. It was about 3:30 in the morning, and it was pitch black outside. The only light was from my headlights and the moon. Admittedly, I was tired because the last call I was on took over 5 hours to get sorted out, so I was focused pretty hard on my driving. All of a sudden, something galloped across the road right in front of me and leapt to the ditch on the other side. It startled me, and if I was a little tired before, I was wide awake now. I didn't know what this could have been. It obviously wasn't a person, but it ran on all fours and it was built like a gorilla. We have bears out here in this part of the state, but I've seen enough of them to know that this wasn't a bear. This thing was way too muscular and agile. I pulled over as fast as I could and got out of my car with my flashlight and pointed it in that direction. I didn't see anything, but I kept scanning the ditch bank. It couldn't have gotten that far, having to push through all the overgrowth on that bank. Just when I started to lower my flashlight, I noticed some movement. I shined my light and I could see the vines and weeds shaking. And then this creature stood up. Took me a few seconds to realize what I was looking at, but once I did, all rational thought left my head. This thing had massive shoulders and it looked like it weighed at least 400 pounds. Its fur looked like it came from a wolf or something, but also it looked very matted and dirty. He locked eyes with me, his yellow eyes staring back at mine. Even though I was barely out of my car and had my service weapon with me, I had an overwhelming sense of vulnerability wash over me. This thing looked so powerful, and the way it leapt across the ditch and even powered through the thick brush and weeds, I didn't feel safe. I pulled out my pistol and fired right at this thing. I hit it right in the leg, but it didn't startle it. It didn't even blink. I holstered my weapon and decided it was time to get the hell out of there. I wasn't going to get myself killed on this back road by whatever this creature was. As I was getting back into my car, I saw the creature push through the brush and head deeper into the woods. When I pulled away, I tried to wrap my mind around what I had just seen. It looked like a wolf man. Occasionally we'll get reports or hear of someone abandoning pets or livestock along the mountain roads of Galix. That's what all the guys back at the station thought this thing must have been. A big abandoned dog with matted fur. No chance. I've worked in law enforcement for 20 years. I'm a hunter and an avid outdoorsman, and I have never in my life seen any animal like that one. I pass this stretch of road and property almost daily, and I can't help but be reminded of what I saw there. Fortunately for us in our small town, we have never received any reports of any creatures as the one I just described. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. I was a rookie cop in the town of Blakely, Georgia. We're located in the southwestern part of Georgia, pretty close to the Alabama-Georgia line. This happened back in the early 90s when I was on my way to work. As I drove, I noticed a lot of activity in the woods. I got out of my car and walked into an opening in the woods. I saw a lot of tracks and noticed an awful smell of something dead. I remember thinking that it was weird that there was so much activity in the woods at this time of day. As I walked around, I noticed a lot of blood in the dirt. It looked like someone had been hurt badly enough to bleed out. The more I walked, the more blood I could see on the ground, and even some fresh cuts on trees. The blood looked fresh and still wet, as if it were just spilled. There were also signs of a struggle in the dirt, like someone had been dragged through the dirt by something very large and very strong. As I followed the trail of blood, my stomach dropped when I saw what appeared to be a deer stuck in a tree. It looked like it had somehow jumped in there and gotten stuck. I could only see its two back legs and white tail sticking out. Now, I could obviously piece together that this deer is where all this blood had came from. But what really freaked me out was what I saw when I went around to the front of the tree. I was expecting to see the rest of the deer, its head and chest, but what I saw was awful. There was blood dripping down the other side of the tree because the top half of the deer was completely gone. I stumbled backwards after being completely blindsided by that image. I gathered myself and went a little closer to inspect. From what I could tell, it appeared that the insides had been sucked out. All of the organs were gone. The legs and the bottom half were just simply limp, an empty shell. I stood there for about 5 minutes trying to figure out what to do next when my radio went off. It was dispatch asking me if I was okay and if they needed to send someone else out there. I told them that I was fine and that everything was under control, so I didn't need any backup at this time. As soon as I hung up, I turned my attention back to my biggest worry. What kind of animal could catch this deer, kill it, then stick it 7 feet up in this tree? The way the body was cut was odd too, almost a perfect circle. Not the type of precision you would generally see from wild animals. The way the deer was wedged into the tree almost made me feel like whatever attacked this thing used the wedge in the tree to eat the deer alive. Almost like using chopsticks. Or maybe the animal was saving the rest of the deer for a later meal. Whatever the case, this was pretty disturbing and safe to say I'd never seen anything like this before. I didn't have a very good feeling about being in those woods, so I got out of there. This was way before cell phone cameras, so when I got to the station, I told everyone what I had seen. They were all listening, but I could tell I wasn't impressing upon them how crazy this scene really was. I grabbed another deputy who was a big hunter and outdoorsman and took him to the spot. A lot of the blood had been soaked into the ground and dried up, but the deer was still there. He confirmed that it looked like the insides were sucked out with a vacuum or something similar. He was actually a little more freaked out than me. The only real predators we had in our general vicinity that could do something like this were black bears, and he knew damn well a black bear wasn't responsible for this. The bear would have just ripped it to shreds. We never did find out what did this to the deer. We never had any similar sightings or reportings about anything like this. Thank you for letting me send this to your show. I really love your content. My name is Jesse and I live in a small town in the middle of nowhere in Kentucky. It's about an hour from any major city and it's surrounded by farms and forests. I have lived here my whole life and I've never seen anything out of the ordinary until now. One weekend, when my parents weren't home, my girlfriend, her younger brother, and myself were sitting around a bonfire at my house one night. It was about 10:30 p.m. and we were just sitting around the fire talking when my girlfriend's brother started acting weird. He kept looking behind him into the woods, and then he would start to sweat and get real fidgety. He told us that he kept seeing something move in the woods. So we decided to go inside and give him a minute to warm up from how cold it was outside. About an hour later, we decided to go back and sit by the fire again, but this time we brought a few beers with us. We thought it might help my girlfriend's brother relax a little. We sat down by the fire drinking our beers while talking about random stuff. But then all of a sudden, my girlfriend's brother stopped talking, he dropped his beer and stared off into the woods as if he saw something again. This time, it looked like he was trying to stand up, so I helped him. "I think I see something over there," he said, pointing into the woods behind me. "What is it?" I asked him as I noticed his face was getting really pale. About that time, I heard a few branches cracking from that direction. But what really got my attention is what looked like two eyes staring at us. They were fixed on us, never blinked and seemed to be glowing red. I was freaked out now. I ran back to my mudroom in my house and grabbed the 12 gauge. My girlfriend hated guns, but there was something going on in those woods. I told him to stay near the fire and be ready to run if I tell them to. I started to walk towards those red eyes. My knees were shaking a little bit and my palms were kind of sweating. I admit I was scared, but I had to see what was out there. I felt like I needed to protect my girlfriend and her brother. When I got within about 10 feet of those eyes, they disappeared. I stood there for a few seconds and then started to back up. I was still facing the woods when the eyes popped out again in the same exact spot. This time I raised the shotgun and fired directly at those red eyes. I waited for a few seconds, then in the pitch black woods I saw them pop up again, about 20 feet to the right of me now. I fired another shot. This time Mr. Ames, my neighbor, swung open his back door and yelled, asking me what the hell I thought I was doing shooting a gun that late at night. I threw my hand up to signal an apology. I glanced at the woods and those eyes were still there. So I hightailed it back to my house and my girlfriend and her brother were waiting for me. We locked all the doors and decided to call it a night. I let the fire burn out on its own. None of us slept well, and the next morning, my girlfriend's brother told me that he saw two red eyes staring at the house from the woods all night. He said that they looked like two bicycle reflectors, and they were too big for any normal animal that could be living in those woods. He also said that while he stared at them, they never blinked once. The whole time he was talking about this, his face kept getting paler and paler. I kind of shook him and reassured him that everything was okay. After I made sure he didn't pass out, I ran to answer my front door. It was my neighbor, Mr. Ames. I had forgotten about waking him up with my shotgun blast last night, so I started apologizing as soon as I saw him. He shook me off and said, yeah, sure, don't worry about it. But he continued, son, you need to steer clear of those woods, especially around nightfall. There is something going on in there. I've had some of my chickens and goats go missing, and I reckon there's something in those woods that's getting them. If you do have to go out at night, you best have a weapon on you. He said that he was on his way to work and that he would see me later. He mentioned he was going to stop back by and talk to my parents when they got home about what was going on in those woods. After Mr. Ames and my dad talked, no one was allowed outside after dark except for him. My dad wasn't one to scare easily, so when he told us that, we listened. I didn't step foot outside the house after dark the rest of that winter, and I haven't been near those woods since. If you thought those stories were creepy and weird, well then check out this story right here. And don't forget to subscribe and tick that bell icon so you're notified when I release new videos. I try to release almost every single day and a few times a week on my true crime channel. The links are below.